be there for every generation of future Georgians.
Roy Barnes, living up to the promise.
Now that Georgia governor's debate from yesterday in Atlanta. The Atlanta Press Club hosted the event, which comes to us courtesy of Georgia Public Television. It's a little under 1 hour.
Good evening and welcome to our continuing series of Georgia general election campaign debates. Tonight's debate was organized by the Atlanta Press Club. We welcome the audience of Georgia Public Radio, which is simulcasting this debate. Now let's meet the candidates facing one another for governor. Roy Barnes is the incumbent governor and the Democratic candidate. He has served in both the Georgia House and Senate before being elected governor in 1998. Garrett Michael Hayes is the Libertarian candidate. He runs a consulting firm and is currently vice chair of the Libertarian Party of Georgia. Sonny Perdue is the Republican candidate. He has served the state Senate and is a small business owner and veterinarian. Here is the format for tonight's debate. In the first round, each candidate will have the opportunity to answer 2 questions from our panel of journalists. 1 minute will be allotted for the answer. 30 seconds may be allowed for any rebuttal. As moderator, I will determine if a rebuttal is appropriate. In the second round, the candidates will question one another. In the third round, our panelists will continue the questionings. At the end of that question and answer period, each candidate will make a 1-minute closing statement. Now, let's meet our panel of prominent Georgia journalists selected by the Atlanta Press Club. They are Jane Hanson, staff writer for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Sonny Dixon, news anchor and reporter for WTOC-TV in Savannah, and Kay Reed, editor of the Albany Herald. Panelists, please limit your questions to 15 seconds. We begin with Jane Hanson. By random drawing, her question will be addressed to Governor Barnes.
Mr. Barnes, once again, Georgia has made a dismal showing in SAT scores. As governor, what specific radical proposals would you make to changing the state's educational program, or would you simply give time to those reforms that are already in place?
Well, I think that the reforms that we already have in place address all through the school system the things that will bring about changes. We know that a child has to be reading on grade level by the end of grade 3, and we've put that into effect. No social promotions. We've raised standards in every grade. We've reduced class sizes in the early grades. We've added 30 minutes of additional time in middle schools. I noticed something that the First Lady of the United States said yesterday when she was here. She said that she was so very impressed with the increase of the reading scores of the Atlanta public school system on the CRCT, the test that we administered. And that will bring about greater SAT scores. And it is true. It's not that we've forgotten the children at the end. It is that we will have you'll see the greatest improvement early. Now, how do we know this? We know that's what happened in Texas. We know what happened in North Carolina when they put this plan in. And we know that reducing class sizes, raising standards, holding everyone accountable in the system will bring about the changes that are necessary to raise SAT scores. I was not satisfied when they're 49th, and I'm not satisfied now.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you. Sonny Dixon, it's now your turn to ask a question of Sonny Perdue.
Mr. Perdue, you sponsored natural gas deregulation, and in all fairness, it passed unanimously. The governor signed it. And what I hear from folks is there's a very high level of dissatisfaction. There has been. What went wrong? And perhaps in the context of the answer, you could give us some insight into how you would view deregulation of other utilities such as electricity.
Well, obviously, in an environment of free enterprise in America, capitalist environment, we generally think that competition is best and producing lower prices, better services, and better technology. In this case, we didn't see those things necessarily because we had some uneconomic decisions being made. It did pass unanimously, and Governor Barnes and Lieutenant Governor Taylor, as well as I, voted for that bill, and that we were hoping to bring change. Why I don't understand why we waited 4 years to try to fix that bill in helping to bring change about to protect our citizens from some of the things that they were experiencing with high gas prices because of cold weather and the upspike in wholesale prices.
Okay, thank you very much. Kay Reed's question now for Garrett Michael Hayes.
Mr. Hayes, since the last gubernatorial election 4 years ago, Georgia's campaign fundraising laws were changed. One of those changes increased the amount that donors could give in non-election years. Consequently, huge amounts of money have been raised. Some people have viewed this as a bribery in order to get favorable treatment. Do you think this situation calls for a correction?
I don't necessarily think that we need to do much to correct the campaign finances that we have. What we really need to correct is ballot access. That's the bigger problem in Georgia. At the statewide level, obviously, we are able as third parties to place candidates on the ballot with relative ease. But when we start talking about the districted races where a lot of the policies really are set and where the legislators come from, those races are tremendously blocked to third-party access. And so people are denied a voice in those environments when they really ought to be able to have one.
Thank you very much. Jane Hansen now has a question for Sonny Perdue.
Mr. Perdue, you have criticized the way Mr. Barnes changed the state's flag and said you want a referendum on the new flag. Could you please comment on what would be the benefits in holding a costly referendum that could revive a racially divisive fight and potentially cost the state millions in business from the threat of boycotts?
Unfortunately, I think good leadership could have solved this issue much differently by allowing the people their voice on this issue. I think if you think that this is not divisive now, you're mistaken. Georgians, we want to heal this process. The way to heal that process is to put this issue behind us, allow the people of Georgia to have their say-so, and let's go forward to the future.
Okay, Sonny Dixon, your next question now is for Mr. Hayes.
Mr. Hayes, if elected realistically and practically as a libertarian, how would you go about specifically advancing your agenda with the bipartisan Georgia General Assembly?
Well, as a third-party candidate, if November 6th rolls around and I am declared the winner of the race, you will see the greatest deer in the headlights stare that you've ever seen from legislators on both sides of the aisle. It will be a clear mandate for the policies and the procedures and changes that I have suggested. So that's the first step, is to go into it with a clear mandate from the people that these are the things they want done, these are the things they care about. Beyond that, I've laid out some very simple and very straightforward things about what I would and would not sign as governor, what I would propose. And one of the things that voters will very definitely see happen in a Hayes administration is that I will not be wimping out like that wrestler up in Minnesota did when he got elected. I will propose what I've said I will propose, and I will veto exactly what I've said I will veto.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. The final question in this round will be Kay Reed's question for Governor Barnes.
Mr. Barnes, doctors and hospitals are finding it increasingly difficult to stay in business because of skyrocketing medical malpractice premiums. In fact, at least 2 hospitals in Georgia are going uninsured, uncovered, because their premiums are so high. Grady Hospital has raised their deductible to $15 million in order to address this. Certainly, healthy hospitals and adequate supplies of doctors are critical to a strong economy. How do you plan to address this situation?
Well, I do agree that there are some areas in which there is a crisis, particularly in rural hospitals. One of the things that we have done last year was to increase the Medicaid reimbursement rates to rural hospitals so they could offset some of the insurance. And there are some fields in which there seems to be a problem. We went through this once before in the late 1980s, and in fact the General Assembly passed what mostly is being proposed on a national level now, that is a cap on punitive damages and other things like that. I believe that what we have to be certain in when we take this issue up, and I don't have any ready solutions yet, is to make sure there's not a windfall to insurance companies. In other words, generally we have these crises when investment rates or the stock market goes down and insurance companies have a crisis. Yes, there are some areas of crisis, and yes, we ought to look at what should be done, but we do not need to give a windfall to insurance companies.
Thank you, Governor. That concludes round 1 of our questions. In the second round, each candidate will have the opportunity to ask 2 questions of each of his opponents. Candidates, please limit those questions to 30 seconds. 1 minute will be allowed for answers, and the questioner then has 30 seconds for rebuttal. By random drawing, Garrett Michael Hayes will ask the first question. His question will be addressed to Governor Barnes.
Governor Barnes, In the last, in the funding for the schools in the state of Georgia, we get approximately 7% of our funding from the federal government. Yet that comes with mandates that far exceed what's reasonable for a 7% investment. What do you think that Georgia should be doing about federal money, and how should we be reacting to a federal government that puts these mandates on us from Washington, where arguably they have one of the worst school systems in the nation?
Well, there's the figures you cite are correct. However, that 7% is very vital to us in operating the school systems, particularly in areas like special ed. Special ed, even though it has never met what the Congress promised in funding, it is one of the largest areas we have in that funding. Now, it depends on what you call mandates. I supported and continue to support President Bush's No Child Left Behind. And yes, it has some requirements that we have to undertake for high standards, but that's okay. We can meet those standards. We can make those differences. And so I believe that we can work within the confines of the Federal Act and make sure that we continue to improve education in Georgia, because I believe we're on the same track.
Mr. Hayes, you're satisfied with that answer?
Well, I'd like to go on it a little bit more. The national government is supposed to be federal. It's not supposed to be feudal. In point of fact, what the federal government does is it takes money from Georgia through the tax structure and then passes it back with these mandates on it. I think it's far past time for someone to actually just pop the feds in the nose and say, I'm sorry, this is Georgia, this is our state, you stay out, we'll run our own state.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Perdue, you have a question of Mr. Hayes.
Yes, I do. Mr. Hayes, as you had a chance to observe, as all Georgians did last year, almost a year, a little over a year ago in special session, Governor Barnes leading our legislature and our redistricting efforts in Georgia to divide our communities and divide our states expressly for the purpose of maintaining political power. I'd like to ask you, sir, how you would have handled the redistricting process in that special session.
Well, I think that a drunken orangutan with a box of crayons probably could have come up with a more coherent map than the one we have now. The idea of districts is that they should have legislators elected from those districts that represent the communities that they are in. And when you take a look at things like the new 11th district and the new 13th district, which scatter across great territory in the state, there is no way that a single legislator from those districts can represent all of the interests of the people who are in that. So we really need to get back to community-based districts that keep neighborhoods together and don't put people who are on the different side of the same street in different districts, or even in some cases, as we've seen with the registration data, in different households in different districts. I mean, in the same household in different districts.
Thank you. Governor Barnes, your first question goes to Mr. Perdue.
Sonny, recently you spoke to a group of school superintendents called the Bootstrap Convention in Macon, Georgia. And in that speech, you said that you believe that we should slow down the class size reduction that we have been undertaking to reduce class sizes, particularly in the first 3 grades, by almost 40% from maximum class size. Do you still adhere to that?
Governor, what I said was that if we're going to mandate class sizes reduction from the state, it should be paid for rather than placing the burden on that local taxpayer, as has been done. Property tax assessments and evaluations all over the state, you understand the property taxpayer, local property taxpayer, are the ones that are funding that. If we're going to mandate those kind of things from the state, and I believe lower class sizes can help, then we need to provide the money to do that. As you recall, we had $425 million in cash appropriated for that, and your administration took that money, bonded it by borrowing it for our children and grandchildren, and then used the $425 million for your pet projects.
Well, I don't think there's anything more important than reducing class sizes. Why? Because we know it works. We know that if children are in smaller classes in the first 3 grades, that they in fact learn better and they carry it all through their their education experience. We have appropriated over $1 billion, $1 billion, the most it's ever been appropriated in any one time, to construct more than 12,606 classrooms. And to say that we're going to slow that process down, I think is irresponsible.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes, you have a question for Mr. Perdue.
Yes, Senator, we've seen a lot in the news lately about the issue of religion in our schools, from the decision, very unpopular decision of the Ninth Circuit Court in California to the current flap over creation versus evolution in the Cobb County schools. How, as governor, would you propose to address this very divisive issue in our educational system?
Well, I obviously disagreed with the Ninth Circuit Court in California regarding our pledge, "In God We Trust," there, and "Under God" for our Pledge of Allegiance. I believe in local control of local schools, and I think that's why we elect local boards of education and have local superintendents with parents involved in those decisions to best determine how they would handle that.
The problem, unfortunately, with that is that it still leaves the control in the government schools, and that's why we have the issue to begin with. This is just one of the many reasons that we really need very true and effective parental choice in education. If we have an open educational system where parents are free to choose whatever school they want, then whether they want their children taught one set of beliefs or another, they should be able to make that choice for their families.
Thank you. Mr. Perdue, you have a question for Governor Barnes now.
Governor Barnes, you said that education in your ads is like a battleship. It just takes a long time to turn it around. You can't turn it around in a couple of years, but you know, you and your party have had control of the educational system in Georgia for 135 years. Now, what I want to know from you, and what I'd like for you to tell the people of Georgia, while you have not been willing to take responsibility for being dead last in SAT scores, I'd like for you to tell whose responsibility is that? Is it Zell Miller's, or are you still blaming the teachers?
There is no blame about where we stand in SAT scores. It should be a cooperative effort of doing better. I was not satisfied at 49th in the SAT scores, and I'm certainly not satisfied that they have slipped 1 point to be 50th. Now, let me tell you, 2 years ago when we undertook education reform, I said exactly this was going to happen. If we didn't dramatically change the way education was done, then we would slip in SAT scores. And Sonny, you oppose that. You oppose the reduction in class sizes. You oppose the accountability system. You oppose the local school councils. You opposed all of that. So at least we have a plan that we know worked in Texas, and it worked in North Carolina, and we're making progress on that plan, and you oppose every bit of it.
And you're incorrect, Governor. I opposed none of that. I supported 27 amendments that would have provided us an opportunity to have education reform with local control, where local parents and local boards of education and our community could be involved in that, rather than a top-down, micromanaged system such as you had proposed, which has dropped us from 48th to 50th in the nation, and you won't take responsibility for it.
Governor, who's right about that?
Well, here's the interesting thing. I mean, what is the local control? In other words, we put in a school council, which is considered to be the best local control there is. Are we going back to the time when we said that local school districts could take one teacher from the state for every 17 students, and instead of having only 17 or 21, have 33? Is that what he's proposing to do? Is he saying, all right, it doesn't matter what we send as money as the people of this state to provide enough teachers for a small enough class? We can ignore that.
Let's allow Mr. Perdue to respond.
Thank you, Morris. I would advise the people listening tonight to ask their teachers about their class sizes. These ads about class size reductions are inaccurate. What I opposed was a top-down, one-size-fits-all, micromanaged process called education reform. That is not the way to reform education, and blaming our teachers, the workforce that has to implement it, is not the way to get it done.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to that, but Governor Barnes, your next question goes to Mr. Hayes.
Mr. Hayes, one of the things I proposed, well, first, in the first term, I have recommended the General Assembly, and they have done so, in giving tax credits that now exempt the first $25,000 in value of a home or a family farm from property taxes. That will increase to $50,000 over the next 4 years. I have now undertaken to propose that no tax assessment can increase more than 5% in any 1 year. Do you agree with that?
Actually, no, I don't agree with it for a very simple reason. The minute you have minimums specified in the law, or excuse me, maximums specified in the law, they tend in inaction to become minimums. The moment you say you can only increase by 5% a year, then that is virtually certain to be the number that localities will increase by. We see this over and over again in things like rent control that's been done in other states, where the government comes in and says you can only raise your rent 5% or 7% per year, and the landlords then take that as a signal that that's the appropriate number to raise the taxation or the rent by. And if we see that in property taxes, if that becomes a minimum, then we have very, very short cycles with compounding before people are paying double what they were paying before.
Well, I'm sure those folks in Atlanta would have liked to have seen their tax assessments only limited to 5% in the last few years. I know that my tax bills and the tax bills that I see of most citizens of this state increase more than 5% in 1 year. In fact, I've seen some increases of 40 and 50%. And it's not right, particularly to our senior citizens and those that are just starting out, to have sticker shock every time they go to their mailbox in the fall and determine how much their tax assessments have gone up.
Thank you, Governor. Mr. Hayes, your chance to ask the governor questions.
I'm sorry, Governor or Senator Perdue?
You have a question for the governor.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. In the last legislative session, we saw spending bills that included such things as $122,000 for a bronze statue of a farmer and a mule to go down to Perdue-Georgia. Can you explain to the voters of Georgia why we're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for a brass jackass at a time when we have the National Guard struggling to find money to train properly for civil defense against bioterrorism?
Well, one of the things that I'm proud of during my administration is that we have greatly increased the funding for the National Guard and for bioterrorism. Let me tell you what we've done in National Guard. We've spent over $30 million to reconstruct our armories. We've also undertaken to create what is generally looked at as one of the best hazardous material and bioterrorism units that there are in the country. So I'm proud of what we've done as far as the National Guard. Now, the item that you speak of was placed in by the General Assembly. It goes into a museum in Perdue-Georgia, of all places, at the National Agricultural Fair. And you know, I didn't recommend it to the General Assembly, and they placed it in and thought it was an appropriate thing to do to recognize the sharecropper and the farmer who had built this state from the very beginning.
Well, the idea that our National Guard is in fact properly prepared is something that I'm certainly not hearing from the soldier on the street. As an ex-Army reservist who joined the military at the age of 32 and who placed himself on the volunteer role for military police deployment in Desert Storm, I am prepared and I want to work very closely with General Nesbitt and the National Guard here in Georgia to make sure that we have a real and viable civil defense plan in place and the 8,000 soldiers properly trained to carry that mission out.
Thank you. Mr. Perdue, your second question for Mr. Hayes.
Mr. Hayes, I'd be interested in your plan to deal with fixing the ethical lapses and the corruption that have occurred in our state over the last 3 and 4 years.
We have a very big, very serious problem with ethics, and that is micromanagement and overmanagement. When we have laws dealing with ethics that become overly specific, we don't actually catch more evildoers. All we do is make it easier for folks to wiggle out. What we need to do is streamline our ethics legislation and our ethics rules so that they're very clear and very understandable and everybody knows exactly what is and is not considered proper behavior. And then we, on top of that, have scrutiny from folks such as those who are sitting in front of us asking questions tonight. Light and information are the two best ethics tools that the people have.
I assume that means that you would not be illegally transferring $10 million of funds from Georgia 400 to buy land in Midtown Atlanta.
No, I've not done that, and I wouldn't do it. We had that discussion previously before. Those tolls should be used solely for what they were designated for.
Governor, you want to step in here?
Yes, I want to step in. I mean, what a mischaracterization. The state of Georgia borrows, and Mr. Perdue knows this. He was one of the budget writers for years and years, where he had no problem with things for, pork or other things. But he knows very well that governments borrow from each other. That it was a loan approved in an open meeting from the tollway authority from the tollway authority to purchase a parcel of land that was needed by DOT. It was the same process we followed when we borrowed $24 million from the Ports Authority to buy a Daimler Chrysler site so we could attract new jobs here. There's nothing being hidden here. Every penny that is due the tollway authority will be paid back. It only saves the state interest. Why should we pay interest when we have excess funds?
Governor, I have to interrupt you right here.
Could I carry on responding to that?
Because just 1 second. Mr. Perdue, you go ahead.
Yes, we've asked for the loan papers. Obviously, when any citizen makes a loan, they have loan papers to back that up. There are no papers. This is a transfer at the governor's direction, taking tollway money out from the 400 payers, buying land valued at $2 million on the tax rolls for $10 million from a campaign contributor.
Could I reply to that?
Just 1 second. Mr. Hayes, did you want to get in here?
Yes, I did, because the governor,
briefly.
the governor mentioned the new plant that's going down in Savannah, and it was something on the order of $350 to $380 million in state guarantees for that. That's approximately half of the $700+ million that we collect in corporate taxes every year. And I wonder how much more economic development and how many more jobs we might have had in Georgia if we had left that money in the hands of the small businesses that create 70% of the jobs in this country.
Okay, Governor Barnes, you have a question for Mr. Perdue.
Question or reply?
It's your time, however you want to use it.
I'll ask this question. Sonny, one of the things that we've been the proudest of over the last 3 years is that we've created 5 new parks along the Chattahoochee River corridor. We've also set aside the largest amount of land that has ever been created in that period of time for public use. Now, we've also created a green space program in order to set aside 20% of the undeveloped land in fast developing counties for common use. We've funded that with $30 million a year. If you're elected governor, will you promise to keep that $30 million a year into the budget?
Governor, if you remember, I was the one that voted for and sponsored the constitutional amendment that would have dedicated $30 million in those funds, not have to come begging for them every year to provide the green space that our states need. If you'll check the record, you'll find that to be the case.
I have checked the record, and I found that you voted for a new tax to fund it rather than taking it out of the budget and prioritizing the funds. So the question is, will you take it out of current funds and not levy a new tax on us?
Very briefly.
I don't know where you're checking your records for. I wanted to take it out of the $250,000 dedicated 30 that state taxpayers, property taxpayers, have to pay the state and dedicate those funds to green space and public lands. That's exactly where I wanted to take it from, Governor.
Okay, Mr. Hayes gets a final question to Mr. Perdue.
Yes. Senator, I want to come back to the mule and Perry for a moment. At the time that spending bill passed, you obviously had already left the Senate, and I know you weren't a party to that particular bill, but I'd like to know what your feelings are about that sort of spending and what it might have meant to the 100 taxpayers in Houston County for whom that amount of money represented their entire year's tax burden.
Not only their tax burden, Mr. Hayes, but also the children of Georgia who are still dying in state care. The computers that we could have used that money to track them. We could have used that money to enforce the rules in our nursing homes, which are not being enforced at this time. There are many, many human needs that we could have used that money for, rather than creating a tribute to the mule and to Perry, Georgia.
One of the things that also went through the legislature in this last session was a bill called the Fiscal Note Act, which didn't get passed. That act would have required legislators sponsoring spending bills to sign a statement saying that they believed that this particular spending was more important than any use that individual taxpayer had for that money. As governor, one of the things that I will do is I will enforce that type of fiscal responsibility and that type of needs test on any legislation that comes before me, whether the legislature has the courage to do it or not.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Mr. Perdue, you have a final question for Governor Barnes.
I do, Morris, and it's I had a question prepared, but when I went to church this morning, one of the African-American families that I worship with on a weekly basis asked me if they could ask Governor Barnes a question. You see, they had received a mailer over the weekend, and they were offended by it. In fact, they wanted me to ask the governor the question of when he sends out a mailer, when his campaign sends out a mailer that says they and we, Governor, they wanted me to ask you, who is they and who is we in this kind of demagoguery?
Well, first, I don't know what you're talking about. We haven't sent that out. But I will tell you this. We're not the party, and I'm not the candidate that has made an issue out of changing the Georgia flag and that wants to reopen this issue to divide us even further. For too long in the South, we have had governors, Southern governors, that stood in schoolhouse doors and that used race subtly or openly to try to win votes. I think it's wrong, and I think you're wrong to advocate just so that you can have, as you said just a moment ago, some of those folks that follow me around waving Confederate flags and holding up Sonny Perdue signs so that you can make sure you've got those votes, and I think it's wrong.
Mr. Perdue, let me interrupt you before you respond. I want to ask you not to hold that up again. All the candidates
and we're not
knew the rules going
notes,
in.
That's fine.
That we're not supposed to use any props. So go ahead and go ahead and make your response, but please don't hold that up again.
Governor, I am not the candidate nor the party that is trying to divide this state by sending out race-baiting literature to African-American families. We are beyond that in Georgia. We're better than that, and I am not the one trying to divide our state, and it's unforgivable that you would try to split us apart like that.
Could I have one more round?
Go right ahead.
Let me tell you something, Sonny. I've seen what you've done. I've seen all these local newspapers. You've gone around to every local newspaper and every local community in the state. You put the candidates up in front of it and put the old Georgia flag behind it. That is the most subtle way. Well, we can show you the articles. It's the most subtle way of trying to divide us by race I have seen, and it is unforgivable.
Okay.
That is absolutely not true. Absolutely not true.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Perdue. Now, our final question this round will be Governor Barnes' question for Mr. Hayes.
One of the things we've done is to ensure that there is local control of schools is to create school councils where two parents can serve on a school council, elected by the parents, 2 teachers selected by the teachers, 2 business members, and then the chair is the principal of the school. Do you agree that school councils are a good way to make sure that we have local control of schools?
No, I don't. I've been a member of a school council in other jurisdictions, and I've seen exactly how that process works. And the school councils in those sort of circumstances are almost always relegated to nothing but an advisory and cupcake baking capacity. What I think we really need to do is we really need to put the control and the power into the hands of the individual parents, not the government, not even at the county level. It needs to be the parents who make the decision. A moment ago, Governor, you made a reference to politicians previously standing in the schoolhouse door to keep students out. We now find politicians standing in the schoolhouse door to keep students in and keep them in a failing system when parents want out. We hear frequently people talk about if we had vouchers that will drain money away from the schools. Every time that question is asked, it's a subtle admission that there are lots and lots of people who want out of that system.
Governor, any response?
Well, I think school councils are the best ways to have local control. We know, in fact, the charter of school council is to concentrate on one thing, closing achievement gaps. And it is true local control in its truest sense. We used to have something here in Georgia called the Board of Trustees for every local school system. And it worked very well because it was drawn from the community. Schools need to return to the community and not be controlled from some remote source.
Thank you, Governor. That concludes our second round of questions. For our third round, we return to our panel of journalists. From this point until the closing statements, the panel members will ask questions of the candidate of their choice. Panelists, please limit your questions to 15 seconds. Candidates will be allowed 1 minute to respond. Again, as moderator, I will determine if the opposing candidates will be given 30 seconds for rebuttal. We begin this round with a question from Jane Hansen.
My question is to Mr. Barnes. Mr. Barnes, the Augusta National Golf Club has recently come under fire for banning women as members. As governor, what would be your policy in the future in regards to Augusta National and other similar clubs? Meaning, would you have fundraisers there? Would you give speeches there? Would you take clients there, business clients, to play golf?
I think the Augusta National needs to admit women. And if they need a good list, we can come. I mean, there are plenty prominent women that I think would qualify for admissions. I'll be quite frank with you. I never have been invited to Augusta National very often, so your other questions are pretty moot because I've never had a fundraiser there, and I'm not a golfer. I'll be quite frank with you. I don't have the patience to play golf, and so or the skill. So I do think that, and I would encourage Augusta National to undertake to admit women. I don't think in this day and time that we should have an exclusionary rule to something that is as highly profile as Augusta National and the Masters.
Sonny Dixon, a question to any of our panelists.
I'll ask a question of Governor Barnes as well. The much heralded Daimler-Chrysler announcement has been mentioned, and there's a great deal of enthusiasm on the coast about it. I think there'll be more once the German automaker confirms it publicly, but it does bring into timely focus the question, how far should the state go to entice automakers or other industries?
Well, that's a good question. As far as Daimler-Chrysler goes, the engineers are coming next week. They've notified us they're coming to work out a schedule for us, and I look forward to welcoming them. But there is a good question, and we have to follow a balancing act here. We use an econometric model that was developed by Georgia Tech to tell us really, what is fair and what's not fair. But I will say this, Georgia cannot sit idly by and see large manufacturers go to other states. We have to increase our manufacturing presence, and we have to continue to make sure that we create jobs. Now, one of the things that I'm proudest of is we took a hit like the rest of the nation did on September the 11th. But since September of last year, we have been third in the nation in creating new jobs, 84,000 new jobs in this state. And we will, if we continue to be aggressive in bringing economic development here, we will increase and continue to prosper in the future.
Kay Reed, you want to respond? Go ahead.
Yes, I would. I think it's interesting the engineers from Chrysler Daimler are coming. I'd like for the CEO to say they're coming to the state. This political announcement about these fictitious jobs concerns me in a political election here where we come down and make this announcement. Daimler Chrysler is nowhere to be found.
Could I respond to that?
Go ahead, Governor.
Listen, Sonny, I know you're against everything, but don't be against this. I mean, this is the best thing. This is the best thing that's ever happened to this state. Don't throw. Well, wait just a minute. Let me finish. I didn't interrupt you. Let's be happy this is happening. When you get a call from Germany and they say we've excluded Charleston and we're coming to Savannah, and they call the governor of South Carolina and he calls a news conference and starts fussing about what the Germans wanted. Let's be happy what we got. Let's not throw dirt on this.
Okay.
I'll be happy when we get the jobs.
Yes. Okay, let's let Kay Reed get in here and ask her question.
Mr. Perdue, I wanted to clarify the flag issue. In 1956, when the Georgia flag was changed, the legislation moved through the General Assembly in 11 days. In 2001, the flag was changed again. Legislation was moved through the General Assembly in 7 days. No referendum, no public hearing in either case. The state auditor, Russell Hinton, has estimated based on the referendum in Mississippi that it would cost $2.7 million to hold this referendum. $1.9 million of that the local governments would have to shoulder. Also in 1993, the Attorney General Michael Bowers issued an opinion in a different issue saying that the General Assembly cannot delegate its ultimate responsibility for decision-making to referendums, and the Constitution allows referendums on only very specific situations. So based on this, the cost of the referendums, the fact that the Attorney General said that referendum can't happen when the legislature's got to make its decision, what's the point of your calling for this?
Okay, first of all, I was 10 in 1956 in the time period that you mentioned, but I was here and present when Governor Barnes pushed through that matter without listening to the people of Georgia. We vote every 2 years. I'm not talking about a special referendum. Every 2 years, the people come to the polls to vote and to express their opinion on a variety of issues. I believe the referendum is legal. I think the people of Georgia, I supported, unlike Governor Barnes in 1990, I supported a referendum on the lottery so people could have an opportunity to express their opinion to fund the Hope Scholarship. Governor Barnes called it a ridiculous gimmick, a political gimmick. It's a proper in a democracy for people to express their opinion, and for us to heal. I think that's what we must do.
Jane Hanson, next question.
Mr. Perdue, please assume for a moment that the unthinkable has happened. You get a call in the middle of the night that a plane has flown into Plant Hatch and a radioactive plume is moving across Georgia. What would you do? Do you have the powers you need? And if not, what additional laws would you push for?
Well, certainly, Jane, I think that we should have a Congress that passes President Bush's Homeland Security Defense Plan. And I think when we do that, we'll have the communication that we need and the proper federal help and communications with the federal as well as our local governments to provide an integrated plan of communication, information, and action. Obviously, as the CEO of the state, we have the National Guard at our disposal as well as the Georgia Emergency Management Agency, which I would call out immediately and work with the federal government and the Federal Emergency Management Agency to quarantine that area and to deal with the unthinkable that you described.
Sonny Dixon, your question.
Governor Barnes, as Georgia does continue to grow, the line from Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink, seems pretty relevant. What will you do to ensure an adequate supply of safe drinking water, not just in metro Atlanta, but in the coastal empire where the Florida aquifer is in jeopardy? What will you do to provide water for people who are there now and continue to stimulate growth?
Well, first, I want to point out that we have enough water. It's a matter of being better conservers of the water and also being better stewards. I mean, this is a state that receives 45 to 50 inches of rain a year. There are many great nations in the world that exist on much less than that. I think, for example, we're going to have to stop using drinkable water to water golf courses at 1 million gallons a day and have to use some type of gray water that's highly treated. Also, 2 years ago, I asked the General Assembly to create the first water planning district, which they did north of Atlanta, called the North Metro Water Planning District. And then we set up a commission made of a broad cross-section all over the state, and I asked them to report back to us, back to the General Assembly and to the governor by the end of this year, which they will do. We think that these methods of conserving and properly allocating will be sufficient for this state, and that we will have plenty of water for everyone, including the coastal empire.
Thank you, Governor. Kay Reed, your next question.
For Mr. Barnes,
Yes, ma'am.
the Daimler-Chrysler plant obviously is wonderful, but existing industry grows weary of seeing these tax breaks, incentives going to attract new business to our communities. If they were given help, they'd expand and grow and add a couple of hundred jobs perhaps. What are you doing in order to retain the business that we already have here?
That's a great question. And the first year I was governor, I asked the General Assembly to restructure the tax credits, the incentives that we give to business, not to limit it solely to new business, but to also for any increase of an existing business. So now, for example, if Ford Motor Company wanted to expand by 3,700 jobs, they could take advantage of the same tax credits that we're offering Daimler-Chrysler. And we've done that with other businesses too. In addition, particularly to those counties that need the growth the most, we've taken a third of the tobacco settlement money, $1.6 billion over 25 years, and created what is called the One Georgia Authority to give assistance to existing and new businesses. It's all based upon the creation of jobs, not the bringing from the outside inside, but it's a balance that you have to follow and make sure that it applies to existing business to create jobs rather than just new jobs.
Thank you, Governor Barnes. If you'd like to rebut, go ahead.
I'd like to comment. I still think that money from the tobacco settlement was supposed to be used for health care, so I'm not quite sure why it's being redirected toward business and economic development.
Well, two-thirds of it does go to health care, a third of it goes to rural economic development.
Okay. Jane, you have a question for any of our panelists?
Mr. Barnes, a computerized child welfare system has been promised in this state since the early 1990s. Despite $30 million